September 28th, daylight, the monsters have overtaken the city, and somehow I'm still alive. If Resident Evil 2 was a ghost story told in a museum, then Resident Evil 3 was a war film shot in a graveyard. There is a specific feeling of being hunted that only this game can provide. It's the feeling of a shadow that is always 3 steps behind you. It's the sound of heavy boots sprinting across wet, soaked streets. And then, the whisper, stars. When I look back at 1999, the world felt like it was moving at 100 miles an hour. The PlayStation was at its absolute peak. We were living through a golden age of the genre. We had already survived the mansion. We had already conquered the RPG. We thought we were the masters of survival horror. We thought we knew the rules. But Resident Evil 3 didn't care about our rules. It took the walls away. It took the safety of the loading screens away. And it replaced them with a relentless, unstoppable pursuer who could only do something that previously felt impossible. He could follow you through the doors. I am 36 years old and I have spent my entire life running away from a man in a trash bag suit. But my first encounter with the Nemesis didn't happen in English. It didn't happen with a manual or a guide, or a clear understanding of what I was doing. It happened in a language I couldn't speak, on a console I wasn't supposed to have modified, in a version of the game that wouldn't reach my country for months. This wasn't just a sequel, it was a fever dream. A chaotic, confusion, import-only nightmare that I had to navigate by pure instinct. I didn't have the text to tell me where to go. I didn't have the descriptions to tell me what I was holding. I just had a lighter, a locked gate, and a sound of something massive breaking in the dark.
Why isn't someone doing something about this?
I didn't know you were still alive, Jill. The police aren't trained for this kind of situation. What could they do? Listen, he's coming for us. We're both gonna die.
What are you saying?
You'll see. He's after STARS members. There's no escape.
Welcome back to the PSX Index. I'm Parasine. This is a long-term project to document all 1,278 North American PlayStation games, one episode at a time. This is Index Entry 45, Resident Evil 3 Nemesis, and this is where things get messy. In 1999, the cycle of game development was a different beast entirely. Resident Evil 2 had only been out for what felt like a heartbeat. In today's world, we wait 5, 6, maybe 7 years for a major sequel. We've become accustomed to the long, silent wait. But back then, Capcom was moving at the speed of light. They were churning out pre-rendered masterpieces like they were on an assembly line. I was still riding the adrenaline of my Resident Evil 2 obsession. I had played it inside out. I had memorised every hallway of the RPG. I was essentially a permanent resident of Raccoon City. I was ready for more. I was hungry for it. But being a gamer in the UK meant living in a state of constant, agonising delay. The Japanese release was scheduled months before the UK was even on the radar. To a kid whose entire world revolved around that grey box, months felt like centuries. I couldn't wait. I simply didn't have the patience to let the shipping containers cross the ocean and wait for the European rating boards to do their work. Fortunately, I had a top secret. I had a chipped PlayStation. If you weren't there, it's hard to describe what a chipped console felt like. It was a badge of honour in the schoolyard. It was a small bootleg modification soldered onto the motherboard that turned your PlayStation into a global machine. It was the Wild West. It meant the region lockouts didn't apply to you anymore. It meant you could walk into those small independent game shops, the ones tucked away at the back of the indoor markets, the ones that smelled like stale tobacco, damp carpets and plastic. You'd look past the official big box releases and find the import shelf. I remember holding that Biohazard 3 disc for the first time. The artwork was different, the jewel case was thinner, the spine had Japanese kanji printed on it. It felt dangerous. It felt like I was holding something I wasn't supposed to see yet, like I was trespassing on a version of the future. I took it home, booted it up, and I was immediately plunged into a world where I felt functionally illiterate. The Capcom logo appeared, the deep voice shouted the title, and then the wall hit me. Everything was in Japanese. The menus, the files, the item descriptions, even the herbs. I was an 8-year-old kid trying to survive a biological apocalypse with zero translation. There was no Google Translate on a smartphone in my pocket. There were no fan translations on a forum I could check. It changed the game from a horror story into a pure mechanical struggle. I wasn't reading a plot, I was reading the language of symbols. I was trying to guess the weight of an item based on the shape of the characters next to it, and as it turns out, Raccoon City is a very different place to navigate when you can't read the warning signs. When you can't read the desperate notes left behind by the dead, I was alone in a city that didn't speak my language, waiting for a monster who didn't need words to make himself understood.
Wait, I have to ask you something.
I know. You want to ask me out? All the foxy ladies love my accent. It drives them crazy.
What? Keep dreaming.
Playing a game in a language you don't understand is a unique kind of torture. In Resident Evil 1 and 2, the puzzles were mostly grounded in a weird museum-like logic. You find a jewel, you put it in the statue's eyes, and the door opens. But Resident Evil 3 started introducing more real-world item mechanical parts, chemicals, specific tools, and without the English descriptions to guide me, these items became abstract shapes in a low-res inventory box. I remember getting stuck at a gate for what felt like days. It was tied shut with a simple, frayed piece of rope. In my head as a kid, the solution was obvious. I have a combat knife in my pocket, I'll just cut it. The game didn't agree with my logic. I spent hours wandering back and forth through the same streets, clicking on every pixel of a pre-rendered background. Eventually, I found a lighter, then I found a small silver canister of what I assumed was fluid. In any other game, you just click the lighter and it would work. But Resident Evil 3 introduced a multi-step process for almost everything. You had to combine the fuel with the tool, but because I couldn't read the text, I didn't know the lighter was empty, I didn't know the canister was fuel. I just saw two icons that didn't seem to do anything. I would highlight one, click the combine button, or at least what I hoped was the combine button, and wait for a sound effect. Click, nothing, click, nothing. I felt like a primitive human trying to understand the tools of a god. I was rubbing two digital sticks together, hoping for a spark that would let me see the next room. I eventually figured out the lighter, I burnt the rope, the gate opened, and I felt a surge of absolute triumph. I had beaten the Japanese language, I had outsmarted the region lock and the developers. I was moving again, but my victory lasted exactly 10 seconds, because once that gate was open, I stepped into the next alleyway. I realised that the lighter was the least of my problems. I heard the boots, I heard the voice, and I realised that survival horror wasn't just the label on the box, it was a warning that I wasn't prepared for.
Jill!
Brad!
We've got to... Jill! Help! No!
Once I cleared that gate and burnt away the rope, the entire tone of the game shifted. Up until that point, I thought I knew exactly what I was dealing with. I thought I was playing a version of Resident Evil 2, just with a different map and a fresh wardrobe for Jill Valentine. I expected the same rhythmic pacing that the series had taught me. You enter a room, you clear out the zombies, and you earn a few precious minutes of silence to solve a puzzle. But Resident Evil 3 didn't want to give me any silence. It wanted to give me a heart attack. I remember running into Nemesis for the first time, and it was a complete departure from everything I'd learned about Mr. X. In the previous game, the trenchcoat man was a slow, walking wall of meat. He was intimidating, yeah, but he was fundamentally predictable. He moved with a heavy, stoic gait that allowed you to plan your route. You could outrun him just by putting a bit of hustle in your step and keeping a couple of tables between you and him. Nemesis was different. Nemesis was an athlete. The first time he sprinted towards me, my brain actually short-circuited. Enemies in Resident Evil weren't supposed to move like that. They were supposed to be sluggish, rotten obstacles that you could bait. But this thing was fast, intense, and felt like it was personally offended by my existence. It wasn't just that he was fast, it was that he was relentless. And then there was the sound, that low, gravelly whisper of stars. It wasn't just a voice line for the villain, it was a tracking beacon. It meant that no matter how many doors I went through, no matter how many screens I crossed, he was still there in the simulation. As a kid playing the Japanese version, the intensity was double because I didn't have enough ammo to even pretend I could fight back. I didn't know which lockers had shotgun shells or where the gunpowder was hidden in the back rooms. I was playing a version of the game where I was constantly on the verge of empty, and every encounter felt significantly less scripted than the RPD. In Resident Evil 2, you eventually learned the dance. You knew exactly when Mr. X would show up because you knew the triggers. But Nemesis felt like he was playing on his own set of rules. He would burst through the walls, drop from the ceilings, and chase you into areas that were supposed to be safe zones. The psychological safety on the door loading screen was gone. I remember the panic of hearing the theme music kick in while I was still trying to navigate that narrow hallway. I didn't have the muscle memory yet. I didn't know the layout of the city. I was just an 8-year-old boy in the UK, staring at a screen filled with symbols I couldn't read, being chased by a monster I couldn't kill, in a city that was burning to the ground. It was a very specific kind of fear. It wasn't just the jump scare, it was the pressure. The game was telling me that I was no longer the master of my surroundings. I was the prey, and the predator wasn't going to wait for me to finish my puzzle. I spent most of the Japanese playthrough in a state of pure, unadulterated panic. It was the most stressful fun I've ever had in my life, and looking back, that's exactly what Capcom intended. They wanted to strip away the confidence we built in the previous game. They wanted us to remember that in Raccoon City, the only thing that matters is the next 10 seconds of survival. In Resident Evil 2, the city was mostly a backdrop. It was the frantic, explosive prologue that hurried you towards the perceived safety of the police station. Once you passed through those front doors, the city was over. The RPD was a character in itself, but this was the contained one. In Resident Evil 3, the RPD isn't the goal. It's just another building in a city that is actively being digested by the dead. Raccoon City stopped being a setting and started being a living, breathing organism, and the shift in atmosphere was jarring. We went from the gothic, quiet halls of a museum-turned precinct to the gritty, neon-lit chaos of the burning streets. There was something profoundly lonely about the way this game handled its world. You'd find yourself in a pharmacy, surrounded by a mundane clutter of everyday life, only to hear the groan of a floorboard or the distant, muffled sound of an explosion. Every alleyway felt like a death trap waiting to be sprung. The camera angles were wider and more cinematic this time around, and they forced you to see the true scale of the destruction. You weren't just looking for keys and medals anymore. You were navigating a graveyard that was still warm. I remember the specific tension of the uptown area, the way the fire reflected off the black puddles on the wet streets, the way the zombies seemed more numerous, more aggressive, and somehow more desperate than the ones in the station. In the previous game, the RPD felt like a maze you could eventually master, but the city felt like a labyrinth that was constantly shifting its geometry. 1 minute, you're in a quiet back alley, catching your breath, and the next, you're standing in the middle of a literal war zone. There was a real palpable sense of the end in Resident Evil 3. It wasn't just a horror game, it was a disaster movie where you were the only one who managed to stay on the screen for the final act. As a kid, the scale was absolutely overwhelming. I wasn't used to seeing the world in a Resident Evil game. I was used to seeing houses, mansions, and underground laboratories. But here, I was in the park, I was in the hospital, I was in the clock tower. Each location felt like it had its own tragic history and its own story of how it fell. And because I couldn't read the Japanese notes or the files left on the desks, I had to invent those stories for myself. I'd look at a slumped body in a cafe, next to a cold cup of coffee, and I would imagine their final moments based on nothing but the placements of the furniture. It turned the game into a silent film of sorts. It was a visual narrative where the environment had to tell me everything the text couldn't. Raccoon City was a masterpiece of environmental storytelling. Even when you were blinded by a massive language barrier, it made the city feel much bigger than it actually was. It made the stakes feel global, even though I was just trying to find a way to the next street corner without being torn apart. I wasn't just Jill Valentine, I was a witness to the end of civilization, and every time I found a safe room, it didn't feel like progress. It felt like a temporary state of execution in a city that wanted me dead.
You want some more?
As if the language barrier and the sprinting giant weren't enough to deal with, Resident Evil 3 introduced a mechanic that added to a whole layer of panic: the live selection system. It was the first time the series truly experimented with the idea of branching paths and the split-second decision making. The screen would suddenly flash, the colours would drain out to a harsh high contrast negative, and the game would freeze. You were presented with two choices, and a timer that was counting down the seconds of your life. As an 8-year-old kid playing a Japanese import, these moments were absolutely paralysing. I couldn't read the options. I didn't know if I was choosing to hide in the basement or jump out the window into a pack of dogs. I was literally gambling with my progress based on nothing but the position of the text on the screen. I remember the first time it happened in the RPG courtyard. Nemesis throwing poor Brad like a sack of meat. The screen flashed, and I was left staring at two strings of Japanese kanji. I picked one, hoping for the best, and then here I am, fighting with Nemesis without a clue of what I'm doing, and I managed to scramble away. I felt like a genius, but I also knew I'd picked the wrong option. I could have been looking at a "You Are Dead" screen. This system fundamentally changed how I interacted with the game. In Resident Evil 1 and 2, the story was a straight line. You were a passenger on a ride, even if the scenery was terrifying. But in the third game, you were the driver. Even without knowing the language, I could tell my choices were changing the world around me. I realised that if I had made a different choice at the power plant, the encounter at the Talk Tower might play out differently. It gave the game a sense of agency that made the horror feel much more personal. It wasn't just about surviving the monsters, it was about surviving your own mistakes. That ticking clock in the live selection moments is one of the most effective tension builders in gaming history. It strips away your ability to overthink, it forces you to act on pure lizard brain instinct. And when you combine that with the fact that Nemesis was often standing right in front of you during those choices, the pressure was almost unbearable. Looking back, this was Capcom's way of keeping us on our toes. They knew we had mastered the survival horror tropes. They knew we were comfortable with the tank controls and the inventory management. So they introduced a mechanic that forced us to be decisive. They made us responsible for the outcome of the scenes. Those flashing choices are the heartbeat of Resident Evil 3. They represent the chaos of the city. In a disaster, you don't always have time to read the manual. You don't always have the luxury of a slow, calculated plan. Sometimes, you just have to pick a direction and run. And in 1999, staring at a Japanese import with a chip PlayStation, that was exactly how I lived my life. I was just a kid making blind choices in a burning city, hoping that the next door I opened would lead me one step closer to the end of the nightmare. While the atmosphere was dragging me into the depths of a disaster movie, the mechanics were pushing me towards something else entirely. Resident Evil 3 was the moment the franchise began its slow, deliberate tilt into the world of action horror. It wasn't just about avoiding the fight anymore, it was about preparing for the war. The most significant change to the fundamental loop was the introduction of the Gunpowder system. In the previous games, finding a box of shells felt like finding gold. You were at the mercy of the developer's item placement, and if you ran out of lead, you were effectively a walking corpse. But Resident Evil 3 gave us tools to manufacture our own survival. As a kid struggling through the Japanese import, this was both a blessing and a curse. I had these jars of Gunpowder A and Gunpowder B, but because I couldn't read the descriptions, I had no idea what the recipes were. I spent hours in the inventory screen, experimenting with different combinations like a frantic, desperate chemist. I'd mix two jars together hoping for handgun bullets, but sometimes I'd end up with something else entirely. It added a layer of resource management that felt much more active than just searching the drawers. I was no longer just a scavenger, I was a munitions expert. I had to decide whether I wanted a high volume of weak ammo or a small, concentrated dose of something heavy. Then there was the dodge mechanic. This is arguably the most controversial addition to a classic trilogy's toolkit. In theory, if you timed your button press perfectly as a zombie lunged or as Nemesis swung his massive fist, Jill would perform a frantic roll or a shove to escape the damage. In practice, especially as an 8-year-old with a language barrier, it felt like black magic. I never truly mastered the dodge during the first Japanese playthrough. It felt like it happened by accident more often than by design. Jill would suddenly spin out of the way of a hunter, and I would cheer like I'd just won the lottery, despite having no idea how I'd actually triggered the animation. It was a high skill mechanic dropped into a game that usually rewarded the slow, methodical planning. But these two systems, the gunpowder and the dodge, changed the vibe of being Jill Valentine. In the first game, Chris and Jill were survivors lost in a house. In the second, Leon and Claire were civilians caught in a nightmare. But in the third, Jill felt like a professional. She was a STARS member, she was highly trained, and the game gave you the mechanics to reflect the expertise. The gunpowder meant you could eventually walk around with a specialised arsenal if you knew what you were doing. It gave you a sense of empowerment that was constantly being checked by the presence of Nemesis. You'd feel like a god because you'd managed to craft 60 rounds of handgun ammo, only for the STARS whisper to remind you that even 100 bullets might not be enough to stop what was coming. It was a delicate balance between feeling capable and feeling hunted. Capcom was testing the waters, seeing how much action we could handle before the horror started to evaporate. For me, sitting on that floor in the UK, it made the game feel modern. It made it feel like the PlayStation was finally being pushed to its limits, not just in its graphics, but in its complexity.
Mikhail, do you have some kind of death wish?
The UK release of Resident Evil finally arrived before I ever actually managed to beat the Japanese import. I remember the feeling of walking into a shop and seeing the English cover art, knowing that I could finally stop guessing and start playing with a clear mindset. I took the new disc home, sat down and started the entire nightmare over from the beginning. The transition from the import version to the localised one was like having a veil lifted from my eyes. Suddenly, the world made sense. I wasn't just clicking on the icons hoping for the sound effects anymore. I could read the files, I could understand the descriptions. I finally understood what the lighter fuel actually was, and why that rope on the gate was there in the first place. But the biggest change wasn't the puzzles, it was the narrative weight. For months, I had been playing a silent movie. I had been projecting my own ideas onto Jill and Carlos, inventing motivations for the characters I was seeing on screen. But now, everything started to make sense. I could read the tragic diaries of the Raccoon City civilians who had spent their final hours trapped in their apartments. Those files are the soul of Resident Evil 3. They aren't just lore dumps, they are short stories about the collapse of a society. I remember reading the mercenary's diary on the Journal of the Dead and realising just how dark the game actually was. Without the language barrier, the city felt even more oppressive because I knew exactly how much suffering had happened in every room I entered. I took my time with the English version. I didn't sprint through the streets like I did with the Japanese import. I systematically cleared every area. I mastered the gunpowder recipes. I started to learn the telltale signs of a Nemesis encounter before the music even started to swell. The confusion of my childhood import run had given way to a deep, technical appreciation for what Capcom had built. Finishing the game for the first time in English felt like a true victory. It felt like I had finally closed the chapter that had been open since I first plugged that chip PlayStation into the wall. I watched the ending, the final stand against the Nemesis at the waste disposal plant. The countdown to a missile strike, and that narrow escape as the city was wiped off the map. It was a definitive ending. Unlike Resident Evil 2, which felt like the start of a much larger journey, Resident Evil 3 felt like a funeral for Raccoon City. It was the end of an era on the PlayStation, and it was the end of the era for me as a young gamer. I had gone from an 8-year-old kid blindly clicking through Japanese menus to a survivor who had seen the story through its radioactive conclusion. Even today, when I boot up the original version of Resident Evil 3, I can still feel that shift from the confusion to clarity. I can still remember the frustration of the lighter and the triumph of finally understanding the gunpowder. It's a game that taught me that sometimes you have to struggle through the dark before you can truly appreciate the daylight.
Thanks, you saved us.
I couldn't let you die.
Is it you?
Are you ready to finish this?
It's coming!
Yeah. It's the end.
Resident Evil 1, 2 and 3 are to this day my ultimate comfort food. It's a strange thing to say about games designed to make your skin crawl, but there is a profound sense of home in these pre-rendered backgrounds. They represent a specific era in my life where the world was smaller, and the only thing that mattered was finding the next typewriter to save my progress. Even now, at 36, I find myself drifting back to these three games. They are the foundation of everything I love about the medium. There is a perfect package here, a trilogy that feels complete, even with all its technical limitations and cheesy voice acting. In fact, the limitations are part of the charm. The static camera angles, the tank controls, the inventory Tetris, these aren't obstacles to the experience. They are the experience. I often think about the future and how my relationship with gaming will change. I have no doubt as the years crawl by, my body will start to complain. The arthritis will eventually settle into my joints, making those quick time events and perfect precise dodges a lot harder than they used to be. But I know with absolute certainty that I will still be here. I will still be struggling my way through these hallways, clinging to a controller and trying to outrun the Nemesis. There is a rhythm to these games that exists outside of time. I can close my eyes and navigate to the RPD. I can hear a specific clack of the menu selection and the groan of the door opening into the next room. They are etched into my muscle memory in a way that modern games rarely seem to manage. They were my companions during the most formative years of my childhood, and they haven't aged a day in my mind. Resident Evil 3 in particular holds a special place because of that chaotic Japanese import run. It taught me that you don't need to understand every word of a story to feel the weight of the atmosphere. It taught me that the struggle is part of the reward. When I play it now, I don't see polygons and low-res textures. I see a masterpiece of tension. I see a version of myself at 8 years old, sitting on a carpet in the UK, completely mesmerised by a world I wasn't supposed to be in yet. These games are my sanctuary. When the modern world gets too loud or too complicated, I can always go back to Raccoon City. I can go back to the burning streets, the stars' whispers, the desperate search for lighter fuel. They are a reminder of where I came from. They are the promise that no matter how much things change, the fear and the fun of 1999 will always be waiting for me at the other side of a loading screen. Resident Evil 3 Nemesis was a transition. It was a bridge between the slow burn of horror of early years and the high-octane action that would define the series. It was messy, it was stressful, and it was beautiful. It gave us a villain that didn't just stand in our way, but actively hunted us through our own nightmares. It was the perfect finale of the PlayStation era. As the missile streaked across the sky and Raccoon City was reduced to a crater of ash, we knew that things would never be the same again. The mystery was gone, the war had begun, and for those of us who lived through it, especially those of us who lived through it in Japanese, it was an experience that defined what it meant to be a gamer in the 90s. But the city isn't really gone. It lives on every time I boot up these old discs. It lives on in the memory of that chip PlayStation and the smell of the independent game shop that sold us a piece of the future. Resident Evil 3 wasn't just a sequel, it was the last escape. And we just knew we were never really going to be done with Raccoon City. We couldn't be. It's too iconic. We had to go back someday, somehow, whether it was a prequel, whether it was something else. But now, with Resident Evil Requiem, we're going back again. I can't wait. We've survived the mansion, we've cleared the station, and we've outrun the Predator in the trench coat. But the PSX index is far from over. There are still plenty of nightmares left to document, and plenty of discs waiting to be spun. Next time, we move from biological to the industrial. We are tackling a game that defined the industry, a game that sold 1 million consoles, and a game that somehow I have never actually finished. We are heading to Midgar. It's time for Final Fantasy VII. 45 games down, 1,233 to go. From biological horror to industrial power. I'll see you there.